My apologies. I know 3-4 minutes are really not very long at all. But I did want to get your creative juices flowing in terms of, well, what is coaching? What do I think coaching is? And I'm doing that very intentionally, because what I want to talk about today is, as you have gathered from the title, well, coaching out in the real world. What is that? And if we're asking ourselves, well, what is coaching? We need to ask ourselves, well, what do I think is coaching now? What might coaching become? So I'm interested in this topic because for the last 3 years or so, I've ran coaching labs to see coaching and what it actually looks like in the room. My experience was that during training, you get a certain framework for coaching. You get a certain theoretical framework, maybe philosophical framework. You get a bunch of techniques, processes, and coaching schools across the board and coaching professional coaching bodies really have an interest into offering you an understanding of what coaching is. How might we frame the practice? How might we define it? What characterizes it? You know, what makes coaching coaching? What makes it different from therapy or mentoring or teaching or just being a good friend? So that question always fascinated me. And what I've realized over a decade or more than a decade of teaching coaching now, across master's level, I ran a lot of trainings at Animas. I've dug my head into a lot of different coaching schools, universities, coaching communities, and the range of and spectrum of what coaching can be is fascinating. Right? Somebody says, what do you do? And you say, I'm a coach. My horror scenario is somebody saying, cool. And then changing the topic, because I don't know what they think they know. And so when I started running these coaching labs to really invite people that I had talked to about coaching for quite some time often, but never seen them actually coach, it was really interesting to see how different it can be of what I thought they would be doing versus what they're actually doing. So I've had this desire to kind of demystify what happens in the coaching room. And I found that quite often it's not magic. Quite often, even the most experienced and professional coaching do very simple interventions. It often comes down to very foundational skills. And often all these sophisticated, complex theoretical and philosophical frameworks, how do they actually show up in practice? And then you have all these coaches that start to branch out and move beyond the initial the initial frameworks of what they have defined as coaching. Sorry, I'm hearing somebody breathing, and it's quite meditative. Right. So let me go in a somewhat more structured way. I've did bring some slides for you, so maybe this is a good time to bring them up. Partly to structure myself, and also to give you a bit more of an idea. So what is coaching is the question. Can I maybe just give me a quick wave if you have a sentence or a couple of words or a definition for coaching? You can also wave with your digital hand. Yeah, that tends to be my experience. Whenever I ask that question, and I ask that question quite often, a surprisingly small number of coaches, we can all talk about it for a couple of minutes, what coaching is. We can give somebody a sense. We can start having a conversation and somebody can experience what our coaching is like. But the amount of people who can say, well, this is it. You know, this is my frame. These are the words, or this is the niche, you know, it's very low. So I find that fascinating. Even, ICF, EMCC, AC, they have definitions, but very few coaches can actually recite them because they are still very broad. So first generation of coaching, when coaching started, it was essentially a journey from A to B, right? And sometimes it's as simple as that. We just need to ask, where do you want to be, or who do you want to be? And where are you now, or who are you now? How could you get there? And sometimes it's really that simple. Often there's an obstacle, otherwise people would do it themselves. We might go underneath or over, or we might dissolve the obstacle to get from A to B. And then it's a straight line again. Maybe the obstacle is too big. So maybe then we start typically with coaching, define the goal, talk a little bit about what the goal is. And then maybe if we find a higher level goal, then there might be an unobstructed way to get there. So very first generation coaching, right? Typical performance coaching, but works in many ways. And it's a really, really valuable process. Now, here's the International Coaching Federation saying coaching is partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. Really very broad. This could include a lot of things, right? The ICF has a well thought out competency frameworks, and I'll come to that in a moment. But this in itself can be done in very many different ways. Association for Coaching brings it closer a little bit. A collaborative, solution-focused, results-oriented, and systematic process in which the coach facilitates the enhancement of work performance, life experience, self-directed learning, and personal growth of the coachee. Again, it's really very broad. It's closer. We get more of a sense for what this is, but you can do this in a million different ways. Here's the EMCC. Defines coaching as a professionally guided process that inspires clients to maximize their personal and professional potential. It is a structured, purposeful, and transformational process, helping clients to see and test alternative ways for improvement of competence, decision-making, and enhancement of quality of life. Coach and client work together in partnering relationship on strictly confidential terms. In this relationship, clients are experts on the content and decision-making level. The coach is an expert in professionally guiding the process. So it gives a lot more guidance on what the role of the coach is. It points to a lot of qualitatively significant elements of what makes coaching. But still, it can be done in so many different ways. And I mentioned the competency frameworks of these professional bodies. And even then, I've seen PCCs, MCCs, ACCs work with the same competency model in maybe not radically different ways, but quite different ways. So who you are is how you coach, I often tell students. The way that you are as a person will come into play when you work with your clients. You can follow the same set of competencies in very different ways. I really like this model by Eric de Haan, who built on Harron's intervention styles that have been around since the 1970s. So this is the playing field of a coach. And I remember coming out of my coach training or initial coach training, and it's been hammered in my head that coaching is facilitative, right? We don't suggest, we don't offer advice, we don't give our opinion. We hold space, we ask questions, and we work with the client so that they can move forward. Right? So this, when I first saw this, I'm like suggesting, but that's not coaching. But then I got out in the real world, and it seemed that the majority of coaches, at least at some point, offer some sort of advice. Maybe they put an idea on the table. Maybe they share some information.
Welcome on board this Avanti West Coast service to...
Well, have a good journey. So have a little think about where you are on this playing field. What is your modus operandi? What comes natural to you? So, for example, my natural style is in the confronting, challenging, exploring area. That's where I feel most at home, right? But I can put a suggestion on the table. I can share some information, especially if I coach someone or supervise someone in an area where I do have some knowledge and I do have some information that might be helpful. Lots of coaching clients out in the real world, they absolutely love when a coach shares a model or does some psychoeducation or offers a piece of advice from other clients who were in similar situations. Clients absolutely love that, in part because they have to do less work if you do the work for them. So I totally get the argument that why would we not give advice or suggestions? Why would we not do that? Because the results are going to be much more empowering. It might take a little bit longer, but clients really like it. And that's why a lot of coaching that happens in organizations is that kind of coach me through this coaching. And many clients, many coaches have this service provision mentality. So supporting a client, suggesting things, fair, there's a lot of coaches who work in that sector and it's really valuable. So I don't want to knock it. I used to be like, but that's not coaching. It's not supposed to be coaching. Coaching is supposed to be this other thing. I got trained in existential coaching, very facilitative, not even solution focused. But I wanted to go all over the spectrum, at least to be able to go all over that spectrum so that I can offer the client what they need right now. So they don't have to work with a different kind of coach, because life is quite complex. But, it's absolutely okay, I think, if you find where your niche is or where your style is. And as long as you communicate clearly what kind of coaching you offer, what coaching is for you, and then your client agrees to work with you on that basis, absolutely fine. Ethically, no concerns for me. Right? Just because the ICF defines coaching in a particular way doesn't mean that you as a coach need to do that. Even in the ICF framework, it's fine to say, if I were to take my coaching hat off for a moment and put my mentoring hat on, for example, that wouldn't necessarily make you fail your ICF assessment. So what I see out there beyond the theory and frameworks of coaching schools is coaches sit down with clients, and then at some point, they need to make an assessment. What does this client need right now? And what does this client want right now? And am I willing and able to provide that? Just because they're asking you for advice or opinions or suggestions doesn't mean that you need to give that to them. So, does pure coaching even exist? I think it's very, very difficult, even if you had a well-defined practice with clear rules, clear competency models. Well, what is pure coaching? I believe coaching is necessarily integrative. Every coach will learn some of the foundational skills. They overlap, right? Good contracting, good presence, good listening, clear communication, offering feedback, asking the right question at the right time, listening to your intuition, being in touch with what's going on for yourself, learning to be in relation with someone, holding space. These are things that most coaches do, and it's good to learn that. But then what does it actually look like once we go beyond that? It's very difficult to define what is pure coaching. Often pure coaching is referred to as the facilitative coaching, where you don't bring yourself in and you really empower the client to find their own answers. But even that can be done in a million different ways. So really difficult to say what pure coaching might be. And when you aim to define a practice with very clear rules, it's limited, right? We've run an episode of our Talking About Coaching podcast my co-host Sivash Damat, he brought up the metaphor of boxing and martial arts. And I thought that was really quite fitting because boxing is very well defined. There's very clear rules, right? No elbows, no kicks. There's a certain amount of time that rounds are. I'm sure there's different ways around it, but there's an official association that defines the rules, and it's clear what the rules are, and people can become masters within that particular practice that is very well defined and has clear rules. You could look at coaching in a similar way, even though it's much more difficult to define the rules, but still, it's worthwhile as an example. Now, mixed martial arts, MMA, has been seeing huge amounts of popularity in the last decade or so. And there, a lot more is allowed. It's integrative. So there's martial artists who draw on boxing, but also on Kung Fu and also on Tai Chi and also on any martial art that you can, Jiu-Jitsu, for example, or Capoeira, or whatever you can think of. They use what's necessary and relevant and effective at the time. And it depends on the context. It depends who they're up against. And I think coaching is very similar in that way. I think it's a necessarily integrative practice. And it's really context specific as to what kind of technique or tool or process or even way of being might be the most effective here. So I think we're limiting coaching when we put very clear rules on it. I think it's really helpful to learn the rules. I think it was Picasso who said, learn the rules so you can then break them. And I see that a lot out there in the real world. When coaches learn facilitative practice, they learn performance coaching using the GROW model, and they can do it clean and they can do it well if it's needed. But they can also just hold space and just listen. Well, just listen, like really offer this kind of presence and listening to someone. And that might sometimes you just need to get out of the way. I finished a 6-session coaching lab with the Association for Coaching yesterday, and I just needed to get out of the way of this client. And it was difficult not to intervene. I wanted to showcase good coaching, and I wanted to showcase what the existential framework is about and positive psychology. And there were all these entry points, how I could have intervened and delivered value and ask a clever question and make a clever observation. But really, mainly, I just needed to get out of the way of this person. And it was hard work, especially in front of an audience. So what that client needs, I need to ask myself, is that what they want? Is that what they need? And what am I willing and able to offer here? So then, was that coaching? If you just hold space for someone, if you're listening for, let's say, 45 minutes and then the session is over, nobody can tell the difference between whether that's coaching or whether that's person-centered therapy or whether that's a good friend listening for 45 minutes. There's no way of knowing if you were to just stick your head in for half an hour without context. And clients don't usually care. I think coaches care a lot more about what this is called and what is the niche and what is the intervention and what's the process. Clients tend to just care about, well, can you help me or not? So what's effective depends really on the particular time that this is happening. One of the most effective questions I've ever asked in my coaching career was, how are you? Because that person hadn't been asked that question in a while, in a way that actually meant something, in a way that the person asking was actually curious about how they are. You don't know often what is the most effective intervention or the most effective question. So a lot of that is happening with intuition, with coaches who are quite experienced. And sometimes I noticed through running these coaching labs, I get to ask coaches, why did you ask the question? Where did the question come from? What was the theoretical model? What was behind it? And very often the coach can't even tell me. They just say, well, it felt like the right question to ask at this point. I was curious about it, or something called me to it, or I don't even remember the moment. It just kind of flowed. So what that taught me is that it's good to learn the frameworks for coaching. And what often happens is that the models that we internalize, because we train them and we try them out, and they'll feel awkward at first, and then they become more like us. I remember the first time when I reflected on a session that just ended, and I'm like, oh, this was textbook grow model, right? Even linear. I thought that doesn't happen, but it happened, and it was really effective, and it was what the client needed right now. And I didn't think about, oh, what's the next stage, or what's the question in the reality stage that I could ask next. It just kind of came out. It felt like a normal conversation, but it was not a normal conversation. And I see that a lot with experienced coaches. They did study the models and they internalized the models until it becomes them. They become so ingrained, their theoretical, philosophical lenses, their tools and interventions. They use them so often that they don't think about them so much anymore. They just come out at the right time in the right way. So really difficult to say what's most effective. So there's something around when coaches mature, they internalize these models, they internalize processes, and they come out when they're right. I think it's important that we keep reflecting on what we're doing in the coaching and where certain things come from. I know there's a lot of intuitive coaches that don't really have any interest in thinking much about what they're doing. But I find that the most effective and the most successful coaches, the really masterful ones, they do make time very regularly before and after sessions to really reflect on what have I been doing and why have I been doing it? What were the powerful moments in this coaching session just past? And where did that question come from? So I find that in this process, coaches often mature from starting out being quite process-driven, perhaps behavior-driven, performance-driven, and then adding in more of the holding space, being with people, and letting the results emerge from that. So when we hold space, we create space for someone, the quality of that space becomes really important. And naturally, I think, as coaches mature, they integrate more of different fields. So some approaches, for example, solution-focused coaching is much easier to do in a more purist way. There's more clear rules, there's more of a clear structure. But also, I think the very structured methodologies in coaching will probably be done by an AI going forward. So as AI takes over more and more of the structured processes and starts to do them better than many human coaches, it will become so much more important that we train and acquire and develop and evolve this holding of space, this relationship. Coaching is a relationship-based practice, in my opinion, especially at high levels of maturity. This being with, it's a powerful space that an AI cannot really recreate because it just isn't human. So then it becomes more about being with rather than doing a process. So I see that as coaches mature and get more experience, they tend to focus more on creating or holding space, holding a really quality human-to-human space that is focused on what that client wants. I mentioned who you are is how you coach. Who you are is how you practice really is the question that is important, because what you call it, clients often, they usually don't care what you call it. They don't care about your carefully crafted combination of words. They don't really care about your theoretical foundation or your philosophical take on coaching. What they care about is, can you help me? Can you help me sort this out? And yes, I do think it's important to have a conversation about how might we work together to sort this out? What can you expect from me? What can I expect from you? But how you are, if you've been a teacher for 40 years, and you've always given advice your whole life. People always came to you for advice and you were happy to give it and people really valued it. I reckon that's going to be the kind of coach you are. You're probably going to have a consulting or mentoring element to your work. And then maybe the professional coaching buddies are not the home for you. And I love coaching because of its lack of regulation. I was very concerned for a long time, but really, that kind of freedom is beautiful. You can do whatever you want, and as long as you develop an ethical sensitivity and you ask yourself questions, you reflect on your work, but you can choose to be any kind of coach you want to be. And that's part of the beauty of the profession, right? I had a lot of conversations in my own podcast. I always ask, what do you think about regulation? Do we need more of it? Is it in the way of good people entering the profession and holding really quality space for people? So on Coaching Uncaged, the Animas podcast, I had a conversation recently with Damien Goldwag, who was ICF president, I think 2013 to 14. He was so passionate about professionalizing the industry. Right? It's important to be credentialed and accredited member of professional bodies. It's important that we unify and standardize the practice so that in his ideal world, and in some ways, part of me would like that too, that I say I'm a coach and somebody knows what that means. That would be lovely in some ways, but also it would take all of this diversity away. So out in the real world, coaches are the kind of coach that their client needs them to be right now. I think coaches could refer a lot more. And I think the more niche you are, the more you're going to be referring. The more defined your practices and your approaches. Once you hit the boundaries, you're going to refer your client to someone else where they are better placed. Right? But there's a lot of coaches that are relationship based, and within that relationship, they hold space for the client to do the work. It doesn't really often necessarily require a particular set of interventions. But coaches want to help. So as coaches acquire more and more different techniques, tools, theoretical lenses, they become more agile. And if you already have the relationship, I think it's wonderful that you can offer that clients what they need right now. If you're, again, willing and able to offer that. So yeah, be who you are. And if you show up authentically and you really want to help your client, that's going to work out well, I think. So in my supervision practice, I see that a lot. Coaches coming in, either trying to figure out what kind of coach they are, but often a little bit further in the journey, they start asking questions around, well, but I've been doing this, what I consider to be more mentoring or consulting, and clients love it and I love it and there's value and it seems to be effective, but it feels wrong because it's been hammered in my head that that's not what coaches do and that's not coaching. So out in the real world, there's this interesting trend that coaching becomes more unified and more standardized on the one hand. On the other hand, these boundaries dissolve. And there's many coaches out there who are ICF accredited, but most of their sessions wouldn't pass an ICF assessment. And so that's really interesting to me, right? I often compared it to a driving school, right? You have when you do your driving license, you have to showcase that you can drive in the correct way. And you do everything correctly, and then you pass the test, and then you drive however you want to drive. Maybe not however you want to drive. Be safe, don't get caught by the police. But are you really going to stop at the stop sign until your head nods at 3:00 in the morning around the corner where never anybody comes and you can see everything? Well, probably not. Are you always going to have both of your hands on the steering wheel at, 11 and 1:00? Well, probably not. Does it make you an unsafe driver? I don't think so. Does it make you a safer driver? Yeah, probably. But there's a lot of that going on in coaching. People passing the driving exam of the ICF. And then afterwards, they do what's necessary to help the client. And that's an interesting debate about, well, is that okay? Maybe I should denounce the ICF quit my membership, and just do the kind of coaching that I want to do. And so 39 coaching labs later, I see a lot of coaches that would definitely not pass the ICF assessment. And they're very successful, very established coaches. One of them, former Animas, actually, she said, I always had this voice in me that the ICF, any moment the ICF police is going to come and get me. And, but she asked, her intuition, Freya Blom, amazing intuition as a coach. She feels inside her client. It's amazing what she can see and sense. And out of that intuition, sometimes the question that comes out, I remember one, this wasn't Freya, this wasn't a training session. The coach asked a question that was objectively a bad question. Closed, leading, compounded, right? And I'm like, well, that's a bad question. And then we reflected on it afterwards, and the client said, that was the question that just opened everything up. I'm so glad you asked that, because it really got me out of where I was and got me to consider other things. I'm like, the objectively really bad question intuitively came out. And the coach said, as soon as I said it, I'm like, I'm being observed. This was really a bad question. But it really wasn't. It was exactly the question the client needed to hear right now. So the podcast is called Coaching Uncaged, right? We're looking at the range of what coaching can be. And earlier today, I had a guest on, Guthrie Sayan. He's an IFS coach. And the internal family systems model is very close to therapy. And I've seen IFS in practice a couple of times. And what I've always been fascinated by is, well, how is this different to IFS therapy? And quite a few of the coaches using that say, well, I don't know. I can't tell you. I don't think there is any. And Guthrie earlier today very clearly said, well, I would invite your audience to consider expanding their understanding of what coaching is. And so literally uncaging it. I mean, boundaries, they contain us, they help us be safe. We can sell coaching easier if we can explain it well within a certain framework. I always found that difficult because existential coaching isn't really that well defined. So clients like certainty. And when you tell them, this is coaching, this is how it works, this is what we would be doing, and this is what's going to come out of it, it's much easier to say yes to. If you say, well, we'll start talking and then we see how it goes, and I'm going to be really present, and I'm going to be listening, and I'm going to be, feeding some things back, and I'm going to follow my curiosity and intuition. That's much harder to say yes to, because I don't know what's going to happen. I just need to trust the process. I trust the process. Does my client trust the process? They don't know the process yet. So boundaries limit us, but they also hold us. So it's an interesting question. What happens when we aim to uncage our coaching? When we go beyond traditional boundaries? There's a lot of pros and cons of doing that. So I don't have the right answer. But what I want to do is help you think about what that journey might be for you. If you're early in your journey, it's absolutely a good idea to practice coaching within a well-defined framework, because that way you can learn the basics. I don't think there's any fighter who starts with mixed martial arts. I think you would start with one, and then you add in another, and then you add in another, and then you integrate. Right? So that's a really important journey for coaches. Start with a well-defined framework, any framework. Learn the skill set, become good at it. Then add in another skill set, add in another intervention, add in another line of inquiry. Try on a different theoretical framework. Do your CPDs. And I love the coaching lab for that, because every month there's a very different coach with a very different set of foundational assumptions about what coaching is or what it should be. Just last month, 2 weeks ago, I had a coach, Devin White, and he wrote me an email afterwards and said, "Oh, it was really interesting to learn that what I do seems to be quite unconventional, because for me, it was just a throwaway comment, because he was talking like, I don't know, 60, 70% of the time. There was a lot of psychoeducation. There was a lot of pacing and leading. His foundations were in NLP, but he was guiding the client towards their desired state. And he was using all of his knowledge and interventions, and he was taking the client by the hand and leading them to where they wanted to be. And he wasn't even aware that that's not what most coaches do. Or is it? Do really most coaches work in that way? We tend to live in our coaching bubbles of our coaching schools. And I always liked to stick my head into different coaching schools and look what they're doing. It's fascinating, right? So I encourage you to practice within your framework. But then when you feel comfortable in that, branch out, look elsewhere. And it's going to be uncomfortable because they're going to do things differently, and they might judge you for doing things differently. So that process of integrating, that courage to look beyond your bubble and get challenged by other ways of doing things, see what you can learn from it. And then making time in supervision or on your own or with colleagues to make sense of that and see what you can use. That's a really, really important process, I think. Just checking time, because I got into a flow and I would love to make some time for us to discuss. Oh, great. We have lots. Wonderful. Another point I wanted to make is there's this service mentality that many coaches adopt, right? And this is often celebrated as a beautiful thing. And in the way that is often celebrated, I think it is a beautiful thing, right? We're serving. We're in service of the client. We want to give them what they need or want. We want to help them, support them. But there's a dark side to this kind of service mentality, depending on how we relate to what that is. Because what I see coaches out in the real world do a lot is whatever the client wants, I give it to them, right? The customer's king, customer's queen. Whatever they want, I give it. And if they ask me for advice, I offer it because that's what they want. And that can be a bit dangerous because I'm laughing with Silvash mentioned boxing, right? And MMA. And in boxing, no elbows. But once the first elbow flies, there's going to be elbows from now on. Right? Because you cannot go back from that. So once you give a piece of advice, especially when it's good advice and it worked, your client's going to come back for more. Why did you give advice then and not the next time they're asking? So it kind of works one way. It's really difficult to go back from putting your mentoring hat on for a moment or your consulting hat or sharing a piece of advice or information. It's much easier the other way around. So keep that in mind, because once you open the doors into a different way of being or working and it works, it might be difficult to go back from that. So think carefully before you branch out of your framework with a client. Good thing is that coaching is often quite short term. So even if you do that with one client, with the next client, you can do something completely different. So that's quite cool. But yeah, that kind of service mentality is a difficult one. I had Peter Hawkins on the podcast, and he doesn't even like the word client, because that kind of implies that you're offering a service, that you're working for them. He's asking, what's the work that the two of us are required to do here? Not what do you want or how can I serve you? What do we need to work together in the interest of a much bigger thing? It's much bigger than you or I. So then you're in service of something much bigger. And that's also a high level of maturity, systemic work. So I think I said that already, right? Once you open a certain door, it's difficult to go back. But at the same time, I think it's important we open some of these doors to see how things land, right? One of my favorite parts of the coaching lab, not everybody's favorite part. I have a lot of people usually drop off before part 3 begins, but there's a space where we can try things out, just experiment with some new techniques, new ways of being. We watch a coaching session, and I remember after my first IFS coaching demonstration that I viewed, I'm like, I'm not trained in IFS, but I could definitely ask some of these questions and see what they might do. So in that experimentation session, I'm just like, okay, I'm going to try this out because it's a safe environment. We're working with other coaches here. They all have their own support networks. There's some good contracting in place. We only go as far as we feel comfortable. And it was amazing to me how quickly we could open something up by facilitating a conversation between different parts of you with some of the questions that this IFS coach, Matteo, another Animas alumni, he done it beautifully. So I felt quite inspired, but with a normal paying client, I don't think I would just experiment like that. I would feel that's not really ethical because I'm just trying this out. So that was really interesting to see how quickly you can open something up. And I think creating these spaces where we can experiment is important. And we don't need necessarily to have a coaching lab for that, or a training, or do another course, or do another CPD. We can also just regularly have a practice client that we charge half or nothing, or just a token amount. And with the understanding that we're going to try some things out. So I think that's important, that we continuously branch out. And this metaphor I really quite like, because I personally, I'm just the kind of person that never really had the interest to climb one tree to the top. As soon as I could see the top, see the system, see what I would need to do in order to get there, it got kind of boring and I wanted to climb a different tree. And then recently I was introduced, somebody, I think it was Sivash as well, he mentioned branching out, and I immediately went to my tree metaphor. And I'm like, that's just really, because we can jump to a different tree and climb, but also there's some trees that have such elaborate branches that go sideways, maybe connect with other trees. So we can create a complex set of a web of different interventions, questions, tools, techniques, theoretical lenses. And the longer we are in coaching, the more we will be connecting different trees. And at some point, it'll be a forest. So I really like that metaphor, and maybe it's of some use to you. Out in the real world, there's very few coaches that are on one tree and they only climb that to the very top. If it's one tree, it usually has a lot of complex systems of branches that connect to other practices. So I really celebrate what coaching can be in the spectrum of it. It feels safer when it's well defined. I get that. It takes courage to just sit with a client and see where this is going. To not know what the next intervention will be, or what they will be bringing up, or what am I going to say next, or what next question to ask, to just be with them. Reinhard Stelter also was on the podcast. He talked about this third generation of coaching, this verweilen, this lingering with a client, this being with someone in that space, being open to whatever happens. So that is what often happens as coaches mature. But also, many coaches develop in a completely different direction. They develop in the direction of having gathered so much expertise that they now combine coaching and teaching. And that's okay too. I mean, if somebody who in my eyes is a mentor calls himself a coach, I'm not going to tell him you can't do that. I mean, I tried, it doesn't work. So people need to do what they do, and clients tend to not care about what you call it. So what's important for me is that you're able to frame what coaching is for you, and you learn how to communicate that or to give a client an experience of it. And then maybe point to certain elements of what made this your practice, your coaching. And if you learn that well, and to a point where clients can say yes or no based on what they have experienced or what you have told them, then I think you can call it whatever you want. Clients usually don't care. It's only important if that's the thing that people Google to find you. If they're the first and you're positioning whatever your coaching is based on what they said, it doesn't matter what you call it. And that I find quite liberating. So unless you invest in advertising or SEO or any form of you speaking first to then invite a particular client in, you need to figure out what language your kind of client will respond to and what they find attractive. Otherwise, just turn up authentically, connect with who you are as a coach. Who you are is how you coach. Who you are is how you practice. And what you'll end up branching out to. Many coaches now work in the trauma space, for example. A couple of weeks ago, I had Julia Minol on the podcast. She wrote the book on coaching and bereavement. I was very, very concerned about that when I first heard about coaches working with bereavement and grief and loss. I thought, that clearly isn't coaching. But coaching has a lot to offer to people who experience loss. So, well, what is that then? Coaching develops and evolves in such fast speed that it's really difficult to contain it. And I'm not sure if it's a good idea to try and to contain it. I think there's certain limits. There's some cowboy coaches out there who really put clients at risk of harm, often with the best intentions. So I think it's important we reflect. That's why I'm flying the flag for supervision. I think it's so important we create spaces where we can reflect on how we're doing things. But I also think it's important to work with a supervisor who's not so stuck in their framework of what coaching is allowed to be and what it isn't. So that's my invitation for you to branch out. And one of the most valuable things I found, and obviously biased, but that was the reason I created the coaching lab, so that we could actually see how these things work in practice. And if you've been with Animas for a little while, you will recognize a few of these faces. They're all Animas alumni. And I had talked to them about coaching quite a bit. And it was great to invite them and see what they would actually be doing and how that actually works. And then ask, why did you do that? And how did the client experience that? And what was going through your head during that silence? And what other questions had you considered but not asked? And what was the process behind, if any? So I love these spaces. It's nice to see the range of what coaching can be and always take something away. So if you wanted to check that out, come. My invitation to you is, come become a member, or we sell individual tickets as well. If you wanted to stick your head in, we have a VIP membership where you have access to all of the recordings. So there's a huge, over 50, 60 hours maybe, of coaching in the real world, as real as it gets, right? There's an invisible audience, but it's as real as it gets, at least in terms of watching it. I find that demos on YouTube can be a bit hit and miss, and it's rare that you get to talk to the client and the coach. So I'll leave it at that. It would be lovely to see some of you. We also run a free peer support group every third Tuesday of the month. The lab's every first Tuesday of the month around this time. But we also have a free peer support group where we just bring coaches together and talk about practice and business and personal stuff. So that's another offer for you. I'd love to make this into a conversation. Feel free to stay in touch, continue the conversation. I always love to hear from people. Bringing coaches together to discuss their practice is obviously something I'm passionate about. So do stay in touch. What I would love to do now is get a bit of a conversation going. So we have another 35 minutes on the clock. I did agree with Patricia that we're going to go kind of officially for an hour. And then we're going to start hanging out and maybe share some of our opinions. So if that's you and you have to drop off, bring kids to bed, eat, sleep, whatever you need to do, thank you so much for joining. Okay, cool. Good. Well, I'm so curious. There were a bit about challenging and confronting that I picked up from the chat, and also the question around, well, how do we know we're doing a good job? How do we know that we're delivering quality if we're going beyond these frameworks? So that's something I'd love to address at some point. But first of all, what did you guys talk about? What might be questions that you have? Yeah, Magdalena, saw your hand go up.
There we go.
Hey.
Yeah, Andy and I were very much on the same page, I think, in our conversation. And what I said was, it's just so refreshing to have heard you share all of those things in the way that you did. And I wish I had heard that 2 years ago when I got my diploma, because I carried this like heavy burden of guilt. At first, I'm not a very big rules follower, so I very quickly left that off, quite frankly. But I did carry this burden of guilt, like, am I allowed to be a coach if I'm bringing a lot of other skills, if I'm bringing intuition, if I'm bringing spirituality into the conversations that I'm having with my clients? But if I had not done that and given myself that permission, I would not have created life-changing breakthroughs with my clients. It would have been impossible. We would have stayed at such a surface level. So I really commend you, and I really commend Animus for bringing this conversation to the table. And I hope that every single graduate listens to this shit, because it's so important.
Thank you, Magdalena. I think we have that relationship with rules in common. I've also been a bit of a rebel in my life, with the youngest in the family and being raised to do what I want, and having amazing parents who supported me to choose my own path and always encouraged me to make my own choices. I think that's why the existential framework resonated so well with me, because what the existential philosophers encourage us and teach us is that, well, you can only do you. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but there aren't really any rules. All the rules are made up. Right. And we can collectively decide, or a majority can decide, that these are the rules that we can collectively decide to follow, like the law, for example, the law of the land. There's nothing that stops. Well, there's nothing that stops you. You can rob a bank if you wanted to. Right. There will be people that stop you. You might get away with it or maybe not. You choose whether you follow the rule or not. You can attempt to break the rules. Some rules have grave consequences. And others maybe not so much. Some rules are absurd and they shouldn't exist, but they still do. I just moved back to Germany, in the land of bureaucracy. There's so much bureaucracy that just isn't necessary.
I live in Mexico. I mean, there's a reason for that.
My wife is Mexican, so I've experienced the freedom there firsthand. There's downsides to not having that set of rules. But yeah, it's quite a great feeling of freedom. But also, when we have too much freedom, there's also anxiety, because rules, they also hold us in place, and they offer a certainty, and they offer comfort in some ways.
Well, that's the great debate, right? Safety versus freedom, like the ultimate debate.
Exactly. Freedom, responsibility. They're the same as both sides of the same coin. Different sides of the same coin, right? One doesn't exist without the other. Some people get weighed down by responsibility. It weighs heavy on them. Other people wear it like a badge of honor. They take responsibility. So you can make choices in terms of how you want to coach, and nobody can tell you that's not coaching. I mean, they can, but only based on their framework. And those frameworks are imagined, right? Part of me really celebrates the efforts of the professional bodies to standardize coaching. And the other part really celebrates that it will probably never get regulated to that extent that therapy did. That's what drew me to coaching, because it felt free. It felt like I can do what I want and what the client needs right now.
Yeah, same. Thank you for sharing that.
But yeah, responsibility. There's no way around responsibility. When we branch out of existing frameworks, that responsibility becomes a huge factor.
Yeah, totally. I love that.
Melina.
Hi. I just want to thank you guys for feeling so belonging in this Black Sheep Club. It's so yeah, it's quite inspiring seeing that how it resonates to me so much. I came to Animas because I watched all the movies, all the recordings on YouTube, like different coaches doing different things, like somatic experience, intuitive this and that. I was like super amazed by the possibilities of coaching. And I remember in the first class, I got so shocked with that like really squared model that I felt that I had to force myself to fit in. And the first coach session that I was coaching, I said, yeah, for the outcome of the session, I want to feel that I'm gonna finish this course and gonna still be myself, because I was like freaking out that I would have to follow all that script and asking the same questions all the time, like everybody else. So listening from you, that's possible to be authentic and really like trust on the process and being responsible. Yeah, I think it's, yeah, it really feels like a place to belong to.
Yeah, and our data is really limited on this, right? My background is in academia and science. So I came through that academic psychology route. So I'm painfully aware that, well, painfully, I'm not sure, but when we have any survey on coaches, who responds to that survey? Where has that survey been placed? Very often it goes through the professional bodies or through coaching magazines or coaching publications or coaching schools. And I think there's probably way more black sheep than there are white sheep, or, you know, I mean, it's not a black and white thing, but way more coaches that call themselves coaches and take money from people and work with them to help them. I think many have not even heard of professional coaching buddies. Certainly there's way more non-professional coaching members, professional coaching buddy members than there are members. And for better or for worse, right? But we will never really know coaching as a whole, as an industry. I mean, once you branch out into different areas outside of traditional schools, it's quite astonishing what you see there. For a number of years now, if I've been exploring the intersection of coaching and psychedelics, when I started reading the research on therapeutic application of psychedelics, I thought like, wow, this is mind-blowing as far as research and impact goes. And my coaching and positive psychology lens immediately kicked in and thought, this has so much potential for learning and insight and growth, you know, and not just fixing, healing, treating disorder and disease. So I started, we are on episode 15 of a podcast called Talking About Coaching and Psychedelics. And I reached out to all of the people who offer training for coaching and psychedelics, the ones that are sitting at the intersection, the ones that are allowed and in the public. So in a small field like that, you get all the big names and they all say yes. So it was amazing. So after talking to 15 people who are leaders, thought leaders in the field of coaching and psychedelics, 3/4 of them had not done any formal coach training and couldn't really name a book on coaching that influenced them. So I'm like, And when you dig into their approach, which I love doing, there's a lot of guiding, a lot of directing, a lot of stuff based on their own experience, a lot of offering, a lot of healing, and a lot of very gray area, very dark gray area between coaching and therapy. Quite a few coaches specifically aim to heal people from their trauma through coaching. So, you know, if you walk in different kind of circles, you realize, actually the majority of coaches have a very different idea from the facilitative frameworks of the professional bodies. Again, for better or for worse, right? Sean.
Really enjoyed this, and it's been a good discussion, Yannick. And
you were the face that I saw when I shared my screen, so I was mostly talking to you. You knew that.
I'm glad I was listening.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So it's a really good conversation about following intuition and listening and really being present. But there's something for me as well about what really resonated was about learning to drive and then go and develop your driving and develop your skills. And I suspect that quite a few of your audience may be people have done some element of training of some point. They may not, but I do think there's something about understanding some of the basics. And I've met people who say they coach, and they'll go very much into a direct solution mode very quickly for somebody, and somebody goes, "That's brilliant," but they haven't necessarily expanded the thinking, the thought process, and helping the individual get to their own solution and find the best answer for them. But I think it's when you look at the basic animas training, it's almost two-dimensional. It's you just learn the processes and you learn what you should be doing. But once you get past that, then you start to develop your and follow your intuition and go where you think it needs to go, just because but that takes time and practice. But I think it's great that what you're talking about is giving people a green light to actually do that. But I still think there's something to be said for having that basic understanding of how to interact with an individual and get them to their own solution. I can't believe I'm actually arguing and justifying following the process, because I much prefer it if I don't. But there is something about understanding an outline.
Yeah, and I think intuition is something like the outcome of your intuition changes through training and through development, right? Your intuition when you get on a German Autobahn when you're 20s might be to drive as fast as you possibly can. Whereas your intuition when you're in your 60s and you drive on the German Autobahn might be a very different one. Yeah. Right? I drive differently now than I drove cars 20 in my 20s, 20 years ago. Yeah. Oh, cat, nice. Sorry. Your intuition is an interesting thing, right? When somebody flips a coin 9 times on tails, people bet more money on heads the next time they flip a coin. That's well evidenced. That's wrong intuition. Daniel Kahneman talks about the fast thinking. It's always 50-50, regardless of the last flip of the coin. So I know that, so my intuition will now be different. And I think it's the same in coaching. Your intuition might be to offer a piece of advice when you start coaching or start getting into it or start having conversations to help people. And with maturity and with training, supervision, placement, experience, your intuition will be different, right? But only if you are courageous enough to challenge yourself and challenge your approach and reflect on how you do things and why you do things and expose yourself to different ways of doing it. So intuition is something that evolves. And so I think that's very important. I remember a couple of coaches that told me, "Oh, I'm an intuitive coach." They've never read a book on coaching. They didn't really have any interest in looking at why they do certain things. They just follow whatever comes to them. And to be fair, some of them do amazing work because they're in their world, in their life, how they grew up. They just developed this way of being with people, this way of communicating, this way of holding space that is just so valuable. So I'm not saying that just because you work like that, you don't do good work necessarily. But I'm saying it's much more likely you do better work if you go through that kind of process. Silke.
Hello, good evening. I just wanted to share that I really enjoyed it. And that I believe, I finished my diploma in 21, and I think when you go through the education, you get out of that with the idea of the perfect client, that the perfect client that is sitting there and is answering your questions in the animus way, or the way that you learn right there, when you forget that the people who come there and you interact with are not the real clients. Of course, they do have their own problems, and you kind of practice, and sometimes it works and sometimes it does not work that good. But then again, when you go out and you work with like normal people that don't have like any kind of contact with coaching, it's so much different. And so therefore I really think it would be good to have like an open mind and to open up, and don't try to be stuck in that box that we get in the education, and try different things, like you said, go with your intuition, or just open up a little bit, and don't try to be boxed in, because that's what you learned, because I think that can be so frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Silke. I do want to do that more often, right? Because when I put something out there, hey, we're looking for a client for the lab, chances are coaches put their hands up. So whenever coaches are much easier to coach in many ways, because they already have a shared understanding very often, to some degree at least, even though there's such a huge range. So, but they tend to be more self-aware. They tend to be have an understanding of the range of what coaching can be, right? So they're much easier to coach. They often do their own work, and the coach often just has to hold space for a coach to do their own work in coaching, because they know how to use the space. But like I'd say about 50%, maybe a bit less of clients, they don't have a clue about coaching. Somebody said, oh, here's a good opportunity to work with somebody who's been coaching for 15 years, and it's free. And, if you don't mind the invisible audience, then, this is amazing. So I totally agree. Once we start coaching people who have no idea what coaching is, it gets really interesting, and it's a different game. Quickly on that challenge confronting piece of the model from Dehan, as I see it, any challenge is a confrontation, right? It's not a confrontation as in what you might associate with that, and it's not aggressive, it's not violent, but somebody might perceive it that way, depending on how you respond to challenge. But anytime you say, oh, that's interesting that you say that. 2 weeks ago, you were saying something different. Help me make sense of that. That's a confrontation with that you've said something else that is in tension. There is some tension between what you said then and what you're saying now. And you're being confronted with that fact. It might be a natural evolution, and it might not be a tension for the person who spoke it. But you are confronting somebody with something when you challenge. So in that sense, it's the same. That's what I meant. And yeah, that quality piece, how do we know that we deliver good work? How do I know I'm a good coach when there isn't an accepted framework of what good coaching is? And that can be a real challenge for coaches who need to know that. Again, my existential lens kicks in, and I'm quite comfortable with that kind of uncertainty. I've certainly been in some discomfort and somewhat distress with some of my coaching relationships, where I thought, I don't know whether this was helpful. I've had a few coaching relationships who came to an end, and I'm like, well, nothing moved, and you tried everything, you did everything right, and it didn't work. Crap. Could I have done something better? Did I fail as a coach? I don't know. And then one of them, I think it was a year and a half later, did a speech at Toastmasters about her coach. And I knew she had worked with another coach after we had finished working together. And then I saw her everywhere on social media, and she seemed to be really successful. And I'm like, crap. And the speech was about me and how important it was to lay the foundations. And, sometimes we sow seeds. And so I've learned over the years, been coaching since 2010. Yeah, it's been a little while. I've learned to trust the process. Because when we hold space for someone and we offer that kind of support, even if there's no hard evidence for results, we're doing good work. And I trust that. Even if it didn't seem to work, it was worth a try. And maybe it just set them up to try the right thing afterwards, even if it was wrong, if that's even a possibility. So how do we know we're doing a good job? Well, it's comforting to have an assessment. It's comforting to get the stamp of approval of a professional coaching buddy that, yes, we as a collective of coaches agree that you are now a masterful coach. But ultimately, it's up to you and your clients to assess that. Because there's some terrible therapists out there, and they're licensed and registered, and they jumped through all the hoops. And they're terrible. So I think, again, probably my existential framework is that you need to own your development and your value, and you need to sit with that and make your own decisions around it. That's all the time we got. Hey, thank you. Thank you for sticking around, for your questions and your feedback. I appreciate it. I hope to see you around in some way.